Hello class, welcome to another video in the series of Southern New Hampshire University's Introduction to Religions of the World. This is the video that will transition you from Module 6 into Module 7. What I'd like to do here is first explain why you're not actually seeing me in this video. My 2-year-old thought that it would be a very, very good idea to destroy the camera on my laptop. So I leave you with an audio file today and a screen recording of a delightful image in the hopes that I will have this fixed by next video. But for now, let's go into our discussions of human freedom. I'd like to wrap that up before we move on to Module 7. So what we've been talking about here has really been great in the discussion boards. I'd like to where everyone is going with this. I think it's been a really interesting conversation. And what I want to do in this video is, for those of you that saw last video where I talked about the binary dilemma of God either existing or not existing, and as a result, you either having no freedom or no freedom, I'd like to address a possible solution to that. I kind of just left it out there as if there was no hope for human freedom, but I don't think that's the case. And I wanted to sort of just give you some options to think about in a more formal way than I had perhaps done on the discussion board. So the first problem was with God's foreknowledge, right? We said if God knows everything about the future and God can never be wrong, then how can you ever be free? Well, the answer to that question really, the solution lies in the formulation of the question. And that is to say, it's not really God's quote-unquote foreknowledge. That's a bit of a misnomer because, of course, in the Christian tradition, in the Judeo-Christian and Islamic tradition, God is eternal, which means he's outside of time and sort of omnipresent or equally present to the past, present, and future. So the linear timeline is only temporal and passing for us. For God, it's perceived, it's known, and willed in a simultaneous instant. Therefore, when we say that God knows what I'm going to do tomorrow, therefore I can't have free will because if I can't do otherwise, God's knowledge doesn't affect my action. God's knowledge of what I'm going to do tomorrow doesn't make it happen. Rather, I can make it happen of my own volition, and God still knew it necessarily because for God, it's not tomorrow. Yesterday, today, and tomorrow are all in a singular present. So in that way, God's knowledge doesn't affect the future because it's not future for God. He's simply knowing it as well as you know what you're looking at, that you're perceiving a computer in front of you right now. He knows it that well. All of your actions, past, present, and future, in this tradition, on this view. So in that way, you can still have freedom, and the reason you have freedom is because future actions are only future for you. And to say that they are necessarily the case in the mind of God does not mean that you couldn't do otherwise. It simply means that God knows what you're going to do before you do it, because of his eternity and omnipresence to all parts of time. So that's how you get out of that one. I'm not saying that completely solves the problem of divine foreknowledge, or I should say divine knowledge and human freedom, but I think it's a very, very significant step in the right direction to solving it, is having the appropriate understanding of God in the Christian tradition. The other fork of the dilemma that I had given you was the fact that what if God doesn't exist? If God doesn't exist, then there's no soul, there's no, there's no spiritual part of the human person that operates on a separate plane above material causality and physical determinism, and therefore all your choices would be determined by physical laws. I think there's two ways. First, you could always argue for a soul that doesn't originate in God, an immaterial soul. That's possible too. But there are two ways that other people have argued for human freedom, even in a world in which God doesn't exist. One of them, and I think this is the weaker of the two solutions, uh, is espoused by Daniel Dennett. He's a philosopher out of Tufts. He's very, very, very good with philosophy of mind, consciousness, human freedom, and things of this nature. Philosophy of science, and his solution, and of course I'm compressing it here and I'm dumbing it down a bit, but his solution is, well, yes, everything is determined, uh, down to the very last coin flip that you make. Um, if we knew the force and the speed and all the factors that, the spin of the earth, all the factors that go into, say, the physical properties of a coin flip, we could predict with perfect accuracy whether it would be heads and tails every time, because the universe is physically determined, based on physical causality, and your brain is no different. He does believe that. However, like a coin flip, which coincidentally we use as a test for randomness, we say, oh, we can't decide, let's flip a coin, that'll be fair. The reason we think it's fair is the same reason Dennett thinks that we can talk about human freedom in a meaningful way. In both scenarios, a coin flip and a human decision, according to Dennett, there are so many factors that are so unknowable that actually go into the determined result of those things that we might as well call it free, or we might as well call it random. So, for example, the reason, according to Dennett, that we use a coin flip as a fair toss that isn't determined, even though it's obviously physically determined, is because there's no way to know all the physical things that go into it. And so we can, for all intents and purposes, call it a fair coin toss that is effectively random, but even though it's not really random. Same thing with human choice. I use my example of ordering a turkey sandwich. I go into a restaurant, I look at the menu, and I order a turkey sandwich. Dennett would say there's so much that goes into that decision, so many causes, both proximate and remote, that go into your decision to have a turkey sandwich, that it's impossible to know all of them. It's impossible to know them well enough to predict, even though the decision is determined in itself. It's impossible to ever predict what that determinacy is. Therefore, we can, in some way, for all intents and purposes, say that the action is free, because it's unknowable to anyone else why or how the decision is going to be made. Now, that's pretty darn unsatisfying, but it is a decent attempt. Without the soul, that's a way of talking about it. Another way of talking about it is appealing to quantum mechanics. This is another way. You could say that, yes, our brain is responsible for all of the decisions we make, and it's only the brain, and it is physically determined. However, when you get right down to it, physical determinism just isn't that deterministic when you boil it down. You could say that, yes, I have atoms and molecules, atoms, and subatomic particles in my brain, and while the atoms obey general physical laws, the subatomic particles don't. There's true randomness when you get really, really far down into the quantum world, in which the basic building blocks of everything, including life in our brains, exists. So perhaps there are quantum events that are truly random. And in that way, we can talk about thoughts and decisions being the result of things that aren't entirely deterministic, but rather the result of some randomness at its most basic level. Now, those are decent arguments. I want to give you an argument here that I think is probably the best, and it's also the simplest argument. For me, philosophically speaking, I like to take an approach which is phenomenologically honest. Now, what does that mean? That means we pay attention to our experience, and we doubt things, and we question, but we don't do so without reason. And we don't, and we should believe things when we have good reason to believe them. And it really seems like we're free. We have an experience of volition. We have an experience of will. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't question things that we take for, we shouldn't take everything at face value. But I think that the clarity and the distinctness of our experience of human freedom far outweighs any reasons we might have to doubt that it exists. This is one of those things where uh, maybe we couldn't argue for it in a court of law, maybe we can't prove it logically, but it's one of those things that experientially is so obvious. It's almost a first principle. It's almost self-evident. Um, so that's how I would answer that question. Anyway, that should wrap up things. I don't want to take up too much time on this. It's already been 10 minutes, um, but that's kind of where I'm at on free will. And if anybody has any questions or want to talk about it further, I'd be glad to. So now we're getting into Module 7. Where do we go from here? We're talking about something now. We're going to look at some religious perspectives that are very far removed from the Western sort of Judeo-Christian and Islamic frameworks that we've been studying. Kind of like Hinduism and Buddhism, and even perhaps more so, the Far Eastern religious outlook is not only providing a very different answer, very different answers that we get in the West, but they're asking very different questions. As we move forward in this module, keep this in mind, and it may provide a better context for you to understand their perspectives.